Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Costain. The Regen Dairy project, a collaboration between FAI Farms and Farmwell and supported by a number of global food companies, has announced the launch of a free online training course aimed at farmers wanting to start on their regenerative dairy journey. Emily Bull has led the Regen Dairy project for FAI, and I asked her to tell me more about the project.
The Regen Dairy project is a fantastic initiative that takes a farmer-led or a bottom-up approach to defining what Regen Dairy looks like. So it has been led by FAI Farms and Farmwell and sponsored by Arla, Unilever, Ben & Jerry's, Woolworths South Africa and Barry Callebaut. So the aim of the project, as I've said, has been to define what Regen Dairy looks like. But instead of creating a top-down framework for how we, working in the supply chain, thought it should look, we spoke to farmers around the world already implementing regen principles on their farms to understand their perspective of what regen looks like specifically in the context of dairy and on the ground.
Regenerative farming is becoming conceptually better known, but the impact of dairy farming, as we know, can be substantial. Now, you spoke to lots of different farmers about this. What was the consensus? What do we mean by regenerative dairy?
I think the beauty of regenerative means it's something a little bit different for everyone. In this project, we spoke in depth to farmers globally, as well as completing surveys to find out exactly what farmers think regen dairy is and what it means to each of them. So we used social science methods to thematically analyse each of the responses and then came up with a collective, overarching definition of what farmers already implementing regen principles think that regen dairy is. So what farmers said, and therefore how this project is defining regen dairy, is that it is a whole system, context-specific approach, taking the overarching regen principles and applying them to dairy. So importantly to farmers, regen dairy is about building resilient businesses that are economically sustainable because they focus on diversity. So this would include things like diversity of crops and cropping systems, diversity in grassland species, diversity in cow genetics, diversity in products and moving away from milk-only systems, diversity in landscapes, so providing habitats for nature alongside farming, and also diversity in people through interactions with local communities. So in these diverse systems, cows are used as a tool to build and restore functional ecosystems, enhance biodiversity, improve water holding capacity, and promote carbon sequestration, whilst also producing a whole nutrient-dense food source. So ultimately, and to sum that up, regen dairy means healthy soils, healthy animals, healthy people, and healthy communities.
You talked a lot about diversity there, rather than just simply the 5 practices that often get associated with regen farming. So, for example, cover cropping and no-till. Why is diversity such a critical element?
So diversity focuses on the principles, the core principles of regen. Whereas when you talk about tools, they're more to do with practices. And these practices are things that get spoken about and told, farmers are told that they should do cover cropping and they should do no-till and things like that. But in the sense of actually understanding how systems work in context and what works for the dairy system specifically, it's about actually looking back to the principles, looking at the whole farming context and what works specifically at a local level, as opposed to saying these are the tools which I'm going to have to apply because I've been told to apply them, which may not be appropriate in those systems. So there is a difference between principles and practices in that the principles are overarching and they allow for contextual appropriateness, whereas practices aren't always going to be relevant for each of the individual farms, especially when you're talking about a completely grazing system that maybe isn't going to be using as many arable practices on that farm.
Does regenerative dairy have to be small scale to have a positive impact on nature?
No, absolutely not small scale. And in fact, if we are going to solve the climate crisis and reduce biodiversity loss, we need all farms of all sizes to be creating positive impacts through implementing regenerative principles. So I guess a good way to talk about this is if I was to describe the absolute holy grail of regen dairy systems. So to me, that would be genetically diverse cows, grazing multi-species, herbal lays, accessing shade and shelter through the use of tree strips that were also producing fruit and nuts, with non-replacement dairy calves being bred to beef sires, allowing an additional product raised on farm within silver pasture agroforestry systems, and then all supplementary feed being 100% homegrown in diverse cropping systems, with wheat being utilised for milling and other grains and legumes being fed to the cows to reduce the huge carbon footprint of imported soy and grains. So in this holy grail system, ecosystem services would be restored with space for nature alongside farming and biodiversity thriving right across the farm, both above and below ground. However, the caveat, like I say, that is an ideal regen dairy system, and that does not mean that that systems of all sizes cannot implement elements of that ideal system into their own into their own farming practices, and indeed many already do. So there's a lot of debate around house dairies and if they should be regen or not, but the fact is that house dairies can implement regen principles on their land. We talk about regen arable, we talk about regen potatoes. And so in that sense, that would, the way that house dairy farmers produce crops can also be regen in principle. And even if their milking herd aren't outside on the land themselves, young stock, both heifers and beef, can be integrated into the system. Or farmers could utilise sheep, which are super useful in controlling crop diseases without the need for chemicals. So I think the point here is that we need farmers to be implementing these practices and principles and moving away from high chemical input monoculture systems that are so damaging to nature. And because of the way that the current system is designed, we need to lift everyone up. And by arguing the semantics of what size or scale is required to be regen, we aren't going to move forward and make that positive change that is so desperately needed.
The Regen Dairy project developed case studies from around the world. What were the key similarities and differences that you found?
So I talked about the Holy Grail and what that looked like. And there were some farms that we spoke to, and they were just amazing people that were doing such a great job. And they were completely integrative, circular systems. And maybe they weren't rearing their own beef, but they were bringing in chickens, and they were bringing in different enterprises to really create that systematic dairy system that doesn't just focus on milk yield. But to go back in terms of similarities, I think the key one would be mindset and the approach of farmers we spoke to in terms of getting things done. And I think it was really interesting that a lot of people had a story to tell in terms of how they got to regen, and that often it came from a negative experience or a significant hardship. So, for example, things like health complications, bankruptcy, family breakdown. And with those people, there seemed to be a bit of a light bulb moment, absolutely questioning the status quo and taking their business right back to the drawing board to figure out how it could be done better without the worries of, constantly producing to pay bank loans and keeping the farm afloat with chemical inputs and costly imported feed. So I guess to me that was a bit of a concern, or a big concern, and a key learning of the project, because we don't want farmers to be arriving to regen for these reasons. We want it to be supported by the supply chain and food businesses and consumers. So a really good piece of feedback from for our sponsors in this project in terms of how they should move forwards towards actually supporting regen transition at scale. And then you asked also about differences, and I think in terms of differences, I was actually shocked that globally regen dairy farmers were so aligned in mindset and approach that it's actually more difficult to answer. But to try and answer that question, I think the challenges that dairy farmers face in each of the countries are different. So whether that is the challenge of moving cows around a secure grazing platform in Kenya, or policy implications and land access in Germany, there were a myriad of challenges that farmers faced in relation to the local context. So I suppose that is more of a challenge for scaling, where local challenges and policies clash with regen implementation.
So although there were different environments and perhaps different bureaucratic environments, farmers were solving their individual challenges in similar ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Mindset across the board was so strongly aligned. And I think that's something that we can really use as a platform for implementing scale change.
One of the unique elements that you particularly brought into this project was the farmer personas. Can you tell us a bit more about these?
So I will try and give a short but precise one on this one. So personas are fictional representations of real life people to support designers traditionally, whether that be product or service, policy or educational designers. They help to ensure that the people designing outcomes are tailored specifically to the audience. So in the case of Regen Dairy, the data that we collected from farmers globally was used to develop 8 different personas. And these personas represent a broad range of categories of farmer types within dairy, from the resistant to regen through to the fully on-board regen farmer. And each persona includes the challenges and opportunities of the farmer type, and importantly presents the best way to engage with farmers in that category. So, for example, some farmers are very happy to learn online and implement the practices via that mechanism, whereas others need to learn directly from other farmers by seeing and doing. And really, the importance of the personas is actually saying, like, hey, everyone is totally different. And if we want to scale Regen Dairy, we have to cater to each of these different persona types who are all starting at completely different levels and require different engagement types.
I wonder why the project decided to look at dairy. Is dairy a particular challenge?
Yeah, it is a challenge. And I think with dairy, it is because it's such an integrated system. It's much more complicated. And we talked earlier about having house systems, and actually it makes it more complicated for dairy systems to really understand where they fit in terms of regenerative, because it's not just saying we've got fields and that's all we need to focus on. It's saying we've got cows as well, and we need to understand how we can make them regenerative. And the other thing with dairy is because it is such a such a different system. We look a lot about how we can transition beef, and when you're looking at rearing beef on grass, you don't have to have the same issues as producing milk every day, having milk in the tank. And a lot of farmers are on a bit of a treadmill in terms of how much milk they have to produce, and that a lot of them have got high bank loans because of the infrastructure they need for dairy. So it is a much more challenging sector to look at. And I think we found when we looked at this project that this was the most important sector to really start making change on in terms of, because there's so much more complexity in how we do it.
It seems to me that within the dairy industry, farmers have at least 2 different product lines. They're farming grass to a lesser or greater extent, and they're producing milk, but often those systems are quite separate. Is regenerative dairy really about trying to find ways to reconnect those processes?
Absolutely, and it goes beyond those 2 processes in terms of actually dairy cows are producing calves, and what's happening to the calves at the moment and where are they going. If you're building a resilient business, that business should also include the calves that are born and beef production, because if the milk price drops, then you still have beef. And when I talked about this holy grail of a system, which also has fruit and nuts, that's not about how we farm tomorrow. That's how we farm in 25 years. And in 25 years, we're going to be 2050, and we need to be meeting a lot of targets by that point. And actually, we've got so much focus on change, and we need to really start thinking now about what we're going to be doing and the products we're going to be producing in 25 years' time. So that's where that kind of system comes in, that we need to be building these elements into the systems now.
Emily, just finally, coming to the course itself, who's it aimed at and what's on offer?
So primarily, the course is for regen curious dairy farmers who want to understand a bit more about what regen means, specifically in the context of dairy. And as I've said, the Regen Dairy project is very much about taking a farmer-led approach. So we've applied this throughout our work, including the training. So the course itself is designed around farmer stories and journeys to provide learning outcomes. And we've used the case studies and interviews to shape the training and then bolstered what the farmers have told us with additional deep dives into topics around regen, such as grazing for dairy cows. The course is estimated to take around 1.5 hours, but that depends on how many deep dives a learner takes. And it's also worth mentioning that you can return to it with your progress monitored as you go along. And then in terms of content, it's split into 6 different areas and starts by looking at what regen dairy is from the perspectives of farmers, and then the principles of regen agriculture. The course then goes to explore different journeys farmers take into regen dairy, and then what they are doing specifically on their farms. And then the final 2 sections look at observing and measuring change and how farmers can do this themselves with some practical tips of how you don't have to spend money on lots of costly tests. And then finally explores the challenges and opportunities, including top tips from the farmers that we spoke to throughout the project. And then at the end, there's also a resources section for those inspired by the introductory module and want to continue their journey.
And that resources section, well, you've got the course itself, which is 1.5 hours of, quite concentrated effort. The resources are a slightly lighter way of people absorbing information.
Yeah. But there's also, if you go to the website, there's also the in-depth case studies, there's the personas, the podcasts that you yourself have done throughout the project, and then also some webinars. So there's a lot on the Regen Dairy website itself, but the course really takes people through the journey of understanding and thinking about what regen means and what it might mean for them in terms of applying it to their own systems.
That was Emily Bull from FAI Farms. More as ever on our website 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.